Well, good evening, everyone, and everyone watching as well, and thank you for joining us. I'd like you to open your Bible, please, at Genesis chapter 1, which, of course, is the record of the creation of the earth by God. A record of creation over 6 consecutive days. And at the end of those 6 days of this creative work, God declared that his creation was very good, and that it was subject to the custodianship of man. So we'll take up the reading in verse 26 of Genesis 1. And God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth and subdue it. And have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth." And God said, "Behold, I have given you every herb bearing seed which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree in the which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed. To you it shall be for meat. And every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to every thing that creepeth upon the earth, wherein there is life, I have given every green herb for meat." And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And the evening and the morning were the 6th day. Now, there's been a lot of debate about the meaning, the theological meaning of the phrase "very good," but we don't need to descend into arcane arguments about that for our purposes tonight. On the surface, it has a very clear, plain meaning. Very good tells us there was no flaw in the earth as created by God at the end of the 6th day. And as the crowning act of his creative work, God made man and woman, Adam and Eve. And God, as we've just read, gave them dominion over the earth, over creation. Now, that this dominion was not a licence to pillage the environment is clear from the commission given to Adam on the 6th day, as recorded in chapter 2 and verse 15. Genesis 2:15. "And the Lord God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to dress it and to keep it." So Adam was given stewardship of the Garden of Eden, and he was to exercise that with his wife, Eve. And the commission is a little clearer from the way it's rendered in the Jerusalem Bible. The Jerusalem Bible renders that verse as, "Yahweh God took the man and settled him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate and take care of it." So God permitted man to exploit the natural environment and to meet his needs. But he was to do so as a responsible steward. He could use the resources available to him, but he must take care of them in the process. And I think these words are arguably, or almost certainly, the earliest expression of the principle of environmental sustainability. The idyllic conditions established by God in Eden, of course, did not last. Adam and Eve disobeyed the commandment of God. They became subject to mortality. It was not just man's physical condition that was affected by the judgment of God in response to their transgression. The natural environment also was cursed because of their disobedience. Chapter 3 and verses 17 to 19. "And unto Adam he said, Because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree of which I commanded thee, saying, Thou shalt not eat of it, cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns also and thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread till thou return unto the ground, for out of it wast thou taken, for dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return." Here is the earliest reference in history to environmental degradation. Ever since the fall in Eden, men have sought a solution to the curse of mortality. And doctors seek to mitigate the impact of disease and death as best they can. And there are scientists labouring tirelessly and conscientiously to find solutions to chronic illnesses. Yet despite the unceasing work of all those hard-working and dedicated people, man has not yet found a solution to the problem of mortality. And left to his own efforts and his own resources, man remains doomed to return to the dust from which he was taken when created by God. And the same is true of the environmental problems that afflict the earth. Air, soil and water contamination, soil acidity, soil erosion, desertification, greenhouse gas emissions, rising sea levels, weeds, feral animals. These are just some of the environmental problems that plague the earth. And all around the world, there are myriads of well-intentioned, sincere, hard-working people who devote their time and resources and considerable funds to addressing environmental problems. And Greenpeace is perhaps one of the leading organisations in this field. It was founded in 1971 and in the past 12 months has celebrated its Golden Jubilee. 50 years of committed, dedicated action to address environmental problems around the world. And in many respects, the mission of Greenpeace is laudable. This is their mission as published on their website. Greenpeace is the leading independent campaigning organisation that uses peaceful protest and creative confrontation to expose global environmental problems and promote solutions that are essential to a green and peaceful future. Very laudable objectives. Some critics of the organisation accuse Greenpeace of having a dictatorial hierarchy, and there have been claims that funds have been misapplied. Well, such criticisms of large organisations are common, aren't they? And often they have more to do with personalities rather than with substance. And if you were going to be very pedantic, when you think about the terms of their mission, and its declared mission, you might wonder whether creative confrontation could always be compatible with the commitment to peaceful protest, but perhaps that's also a question of semantics. It is certainly not our objective tonight to denigrate Greenpeace. I've dealt personally with Greenpeace in my work, and people involved with Greenpeace who I have only the highest regard for. For our purposes tonight, we are happy to assume that Greenpeace is a well-meaning organisation committed to the best possible outcomes for the earth. What we wish to do tonight is to take the opportunity of that golden jubilee of those 50 years of work to consider whether organisations like Greenpeace can provide the environmental solutions the world needs. Greenpeace was founded in Canada in 1971. Its first campaign was against US nuclear testing off the coast of Alaska. And the founders of Greenpeace chartered a fishing vessel, and they placed themselves in harm's way to disrupt those tests. And since its very founding, ships have played a crucial and prominent role in Greenpeace's activities. The organisation's international profile was secured by an incident in New Zealand in 1985, which I'm sure many of you in the audience will remember. Some of you won't, at least one of you wasn't alive, but those of us who were will remember the sinking of the Rainbow Warrior in New Zealand in 1985. Now, you might think that their use of the word rainbow in this context is indicative of homosexual sympathies. In fact, it's got nothing to do with that. The name is very interesting, and the background to the name is very interesting. The name was selected long before the homosexual lobby had hijacked the image of the rainbow and the word gay. The name Rainbow Warrior is derived from a book, Warriors of the Rainbow. Warriors of the Rainbow was an evangelical Christian work written by two men, Mr. William Willoyer and Vincent Brown, and published in 1962. This bizarre book fabricated a number of fictitious North American Indian prophecies and related them to the second coming of Christ through a very complex and convoluted method. It is, in fact, today a thoroughly discredited work, and it's been criticised for many things, amongst them for promoting anti-Semitism. But the book included what it claimed, what it had made up and alleged to be, an Indian prophecy that said, when the world is sick and dying, the people will rise up like warriors of the rainbow. Now, in 1969, 2 years before it was founded, Greenpeace's co-founder, Mr. Bob Hunter, was given a copy of Warriors of the Rainbow by a wandering dulcimer maker. Now, I'm sure all of us have been accosted by wandering dulcimer makers in our day. On this particular day, he was also hawking copies of Warriors of the Rainbow. I suppose you've got to have another line of business if you're selling dulcimers for a living. Now, that's how Mr. Hunter got the book. And on the group's first expedition to stop those nuclear tests off Alaska in 1971, he passed this book around those on the ship. And the founders of the group were much taken by that alleged prophecy, and they adopted the name for 3 consecutive ships that the organisation has operated to prosecute its campaigns. And the first of these was a British trawler that Greenpeace purchased in 1977. And that trawler was refitted for their purposes and was renamed Rainbow Warrior. Now again, most of you in the audience will remember that from 1966 to 1996, France tested nuclear weapons in its territories in the Pacific, in particular at Mururoa Atoll. And Australia and New Zealand and other Pacific nations objected to those tests. Greenpeace also objected, and in 1985 it sent its ship, the Rainbow Warrior, to the South Pacific to confront the French at the testing ground and to disrupt those tests. And then the ship went to Auckland for a visit. And on the 10th of July 1985, the Rainbow Warrior was moored at a wharf in Auckland Harbour. At around midnight that night, 2 bombs which had been attached to the hull of the ship exploded. They opened a large hole below the waterline and the ship sank at her moorings. 1 crew member was killed, but all the others survived. An attempt was made to salvage the ship, but the damage was too great, and in 1987 she was scuttled off the coast of New Zealand. It very soon became clear that French agents had sabotaged the French. It created an international incident and indeed a political crisis in France. This would be the same French government, of course, that accuses other nations of duplicity. Never mind, nations aren't always perfect. The French perhaps less than most. I'm sure they're no worse than the average, actually. Well, the sinking of the Rainbow Warrior obviously was a blow to the organisation, but they've since had 2 further ships named, each one named Rainbow Warrior, and they've actually actively pursued their range of environmental campaigns since then. Now, as I said, that there are serious environmental problems that need attention is obvious to anyone. You know, everyone understands that this world is beset by myriad serious environmental problems. We've already listed some of those earlier tonight at a global level, and of course, at a local level, there are many smaller problems that are having an adverse impact on the environment. And there are countless scientists working hard around the world to find solutions to these problems. But sometimes the solutions they implement create unintended problems of their own. DDT is an insecticide that has had a terrible impact on the environment. It is a dreadful product which has had dreadful impacts where it's been used. And Greenpeace has long campaigned for the phasing out of the use of DDT. In particular, they've mounted a very active and aggressive campaign to close down the last major factory in the world which manufactures DDT. Now, to environmentalists who live comfortable lives in the developed world, phasing out the use of a dangerous chemical like DDT sounds like a reasonable objective. We would no longer use it here, for instance. But phasing it out has had a seriously adverse impact on millions of people living in the developing world, because an unintended consequence of the phasing out of that chemical has been that it's made the eradication of malaria much harder in those poor countries. And one respected health scientist made this observation about the ban on DDT, that it may have killed 20 million children. Now, obviously, that was not the intent of the people who were campaigning to get rid of this awful chemical, but the impact of stopping its use in some countries where malaria is rife has been to lead to an increase in the rate of malaria in those countries. The conundrum of what to do about DDT without hampering anti-malarial efforts is typical of many of the environmental challenges facing the world today. Simple, uncomplicated solutions to complex problems are rarely available. In many cases, there are trade-offs that need to be considered. The current so-called crisis in the energy market in this country illustrates some of the challenges and the trade-offs that are hard to manage. It should not surprise us that even dedicated and sincere and hard-working men and women cannot solve the intractable and interconnected environmental problems that plague the world. The Bible tells us that man is unable to provide the answers to the most challenging of issues. The prophet Jeremiah summed up the challenge in these words: "The way of man is not in himself. It is not in man that walketh to direct his steps." And the prophet Isaiah had a similar sentiment: "Cease ye from man whose breath is in his nostrils, for wherein is he to be accounted of?" We are deluded if we imagine that man can solve the problems that man has brought upon himself and the world. The weaknesses inherent in man mean that his very best efforts are likely to be only partially effective at best. And even when his intentions are aspirational, his actions often fail to live up to those high expectations. In Australia today, we enjoy a very high standard of living, and that standard of living has been built on the extensive consumption of fossil fuels. And that, of course, has been associated with a massive increase in greenhouse gas emissions. Now, today, there is very strong support for reducing greenhouse gas emissions through reduction in the use of fossil fuels. This sounds reasonable, of course, to people who are well off, but what does it mean for people in poorer developing nations who are seeking to improve their standard of living to come somewhere a little closer to the one that we enjoy? Is it reasonable to expect them to sacrifice the benefits that we take for granted and have established for ourselves by burning fossil fuels? And of course, while the Western world is strongly committed to that end, there are all sorts of complications that come about, such as the current environmental energy market crisis in Australia, which has seen the need to crank up the use of fossil fuels in the production of electricity. Germany is in the process of reactivating several coal-fired power stations because of the war in Ukraine and the interruption to fuel supplies from the Soviet Union. So man tries to do these things, but there are constantly challenges that come from left field. People say they are very committed to these things, especially in the Western world and in Australia. But there are good reasons for doubting the commitment of Australians to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. In a study conducted in 2019 and written up and published in early 2021, Australian voters were asked to indicate their level of support for action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And this is what the researchers found. Now, I will be using mostly data from 2019 deliberately, because it was the last year before the pandemic, which distorted a lot of people's behaviours and actions for obvious reasons in the Western world. And also because, as you can see, this study was done in 2019, but took till 2021 to actually analyse and report the results. Such very good academic research often takes a long time to finalise. So I'm deliberately drawing my figures for the last year prior to the pandemic recognising that sentiments would have changed to some degree. So with that caveat, let's just proceed. This study found that over 80% of Australians professed that they view action to reduce Australia's emissions as important. That included 70% of Conservative voters for the coalition. And if you listen to the media and to news reports, that won't come as any surprise to you. That's what the voters told the researchers when they were asked in 2019. But are those attitudes reflected in their lifestyle choices in 2019? Well, let's think of the cars Australians choose to buy. A very relevant question, because in Adelaide we live in a city that seems to be devoted to the motor car. Almost every adult seems to own a motor car. It's not uncommon for 4 or more cars to be owned by the occupants of one house. That survey showed that 80% of Australians think it's important to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in 2019. Well, what were the most popular cars purchased by Australians in that year? They are the most popular cars purchased in 2019 in Australia, ranked 1 to 4. You'll note that none of these could be described as a small car. Indeed, SUVs accounted for 45.5% of all new cars purchased in Australia in 2019. That rose, incidentally, to 49.6% in 2020, when you couldn't actually go anywhere in your car. None of the most popular cars in 2019 was an electric vehicle. One hybrid amongst them, but none, and number 4, none of them electric. One commentator writing about interest in electric vehicles in Australia in 2019 said this: 2019 saw a big year. This was a big year for electric car sales within Australia, with 6,718 fully electric and plug-in hybrid cars sold. 0.6% of total car sales within Australia in 2019. And there's the rate. I'm sorry, that doesn't make that clear, that that's the rate of electrical vehicle sales per 10,000 vehicles in the graph, in state by state. South Australia does rather well, 21 per 10,000, so 0.2%. This commentator says 0.6% of car sales is a big year for electric car sales within Australia. Suggests that there's a large gap between the environmentally concerned rhetoric of average Australians and their actions in the marketplace. Well, let's think about dwelling size. The preference of Australians for large vehicles also is reflected in their desire to live in large houses. The ComSec Home Size Trends report, published in November 2020, found that the average size of a newly built house in Australia in 2019-20 was 235.8 square metres, up 2.9% year on year, the biggest yearly increase in 11 years. They're big houses, the biggest in the world, bigger than the average house in America. Newly built apartments have also increased in size, with the size of the average new apartment up 6% year on year. So Australia is building now the largest houses in the world, on average, even larger, as I said, than the United States. And most of these large houses and apartments are air-conditioned. And if you go to the new subdivisions, you'll see why, because there's no room for eaves on these houses. They're so close together, and the blocks of land are so small. So they're mostly air-conditioned, meaning that electricity demand is higher than it was for the average house a generation ago. When I was growing up, we knew nobody who lived in an air-conditioned house. I now know very few people who don't live in an air-conditioned house. But literally knew nobody. The first person I knew who had an air conditioner was my grandmother, who got one when she was in her 70s. And it was a little standalone unit that she could move around the house with her. That was the closest we knew to home air conditioning when I was growing up. That is not the case for our children today, is it? And large buildings don't just consume energy through being occupied. Large buildings require more materials, all of which have embedded energy in their processing and their delivery, especially in a country of this size. The incessant urban sprawl that is evident in all Australian cities also means that valuable agricultural land in the outskirts of cities is being redeveloped for housing, which means, of course, that that land is no longer available for productive purposes. And just last weekend, when we came back from the Barossa, we came back past brand new subdivisions on land that used to be devoted to the growing of vegetables only a few years ago. And the pandemic that we've endured since the beginning of 2020 has helped to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from vehicles. But the ComSec Home Sites Trends Report says it has fueled demand for larger dwellings. It's actually increasing people's desire for larger houses. Because when people are forced to spend more time at home with their families, they become interested in having more space available to make that time more bearable. And I could well sympathise. I read about a family with 5 sons, all doing homeschooling. I'm sure it was a nightmare for them, for everybody concerned. The pandemic also has brought to light another sign that Australians are not as committed to greenhouse gas emissions as their rhetoric might imply. In response to the pandemic, of course, Australia's borders were closed in March 2020. That torpedoed the intentions of 2.2 million Australians who had planned an overseas vacation in the next 12 months. My sister was one of them, and she's still complaining. That is nearly 10% of the population had planned an overseas holiday in the 12 months after they slammed the borders closed. Nearly 10% of the population. Now, my guess is that only a handful of that cohort of 2.2 million were able to actually leave in the period. A small number would have got away through various means, and because there were a small number leaving the country, but not very many. Statistics published by Tourism Research Australia show that in the year to June 2019, Australians over the age of 15 spent $62.3 billion on international travel. $62.3 billion on international travel. That's an average of $3,115 per person in the country. The Tourism and Transport Forum put the average outbound spend at $59.3 billion a year for the period from 2016 to 2019. They're breathtaking sums, aren't they? How many hospitals can you build for $53 billion? When you listen to people commenting on the impact of the pandemic on their lives, I find it amazing, somewhat depressing, how often their biggest complaint is about being not able to travel overseas. And from comments made in the media, it's obvious that a great many Australians are determined to take overseas holidays as soon as they feel confident enough that the borders are open and will stay open. Yet very few of those who holiday overseas plan to travel via sailing ship. Most of them will travel by jet aircraft, which use high-octane fuels and are one of the greatest domestic contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. And some will pay an offset to cover those emissions, but the damage has already been done. And yet in the years prior to the pandemic, including 2019, demand for international and domestic air travel was growing exponentially. Some Australians are so obsessed by travel that it defines their very existence. Amid a global pandemic, a man from Sydney named Ben Groundwater had the audacity to write an article which was published on the 11th of August 2021 on the traveller.com website under the title, International Travel and COVID-19, How Can Travellers Define Themselves Without Being Able to Travel? And in his article he made this extraordinary statement: if I'm not the guy who travels, who am I? And if life isn't filled with overseas adventure or the anticipation of the next trip, what do I have instead? It's all a bit tragic, really, isn't it? This is the man who has 2 children, by the way, who don't feature as part of why he exists and how he defines his life. I note. He was lamenting how he'd had to spend his time, instead of travelling, with his children down the park with their bikes. It's pathetic, really. lamenting the inability to travel overseas is really very much a first world problem. There's lots of people overseas who wish they could have that as their biggest problem. In 2014, Greenpeace campaigned against plans to expand London's Heathrow Airport. And in the context of that campaign, it made this statement: "The growth in aviation is ruining our chances of stopping dangerous climate change." And they're probably right. A passion for air travel is not confined to hedonistic Australian travel makers. Even leading environmentalists often are frequent flyers. Prior to the pandemic, you'll recall that there were regular international summits to discuss greenhouse gas emissions and the need to reduce carbon levels in the atmosphere, held in places like Kyoto, Paris, Rio de Janeiro. The most recent one was in Glasgow in November 2021. Thousands of scientists and delegates and politicians and reporters from all around the world attended those summits, almost all of them travelling by jet aircraft. Surely that seems ironic at least, if not hypocritical. When the Glasgow summit was on, I noticed that Mr Johnson, the British Prime Minister, travelled from London to Glasgow by plane to attend the summit. He was then criticised as it being inappropriate, so the next time he went, later in the week when he went back to the summit, he went by train, presumably also fuelled though by diesel. This is an era when we can actually do, as we proved during the pandemic, virtual meetings. Before I retired, I worked for a business which built a new head office in the central business district of Adelaide, and it invested a considerable sum, an eye-watering sum in fact, to ensure that it was an environmentally sustainable building, as environmentally sustainable as possible. And when completed, it was the first commercial building in Australia to be awarded a 6 Green Star rating. In the hope of maximising publicity of that achievement, the famous environmentalist David Suzuki was invited to travel to Australia to open the building. They didn't stop to think about the conflict here. Dr Suzuki did, however. He declined the invitation because, and I saw the letter where he replied, as a man committed to saving the environment, he could not in good conscience continue to travel by air. He recognised he had to make sacrifices to match his convictions. Unlike Dr Suzuki, some political leaders don't seem to be so concerned about their air travel, often on VIP jets. And even Greenpeace does not have a clean slate in regard to this matter. In 2013, remember this statement up there is 2014 about the expansion of Heathrow Airport. In 2013, it was reported that Pascal Hustings, who's the director of Greenpeace's international program, was commuting every day 400 kilometres to work by plane. Commuting 400 kilometres by plane every day to his office, despite Greenpeace's activism to reduce air travel due to its carbon footprint. It was only after there was a public uproar when that had been exposed that Greenpeace announced that Mr Hustings would commute by train from then on. Now, in highlighting these statistics and these trends, I certainly am not posing or seeking to pose as a crusade as a self-righteous environmental Puritan. I don't condemn people for their choices. Personally, for my purposes, I have never paid for myself to travel overseas, but I've purchased plenty of tickets for many domestic flights. I live in a large house, an air-conditioned house, and I have a car that I drive and it's not an electric vehicle. I'm merely making the point that even though most people express support for environmental views espoused by Greenpeace, they are reluctant actually to adjust their own lifestyle to achieve the changes required to address the environmental problems besetting the world. Even people at the highest level of Greenpeace struggle with this. And that's no surprise to anybody who knows their Bible. We've already noted those words from Isaiah and Jeremiah, haven't we, about the fact that men cannot be relied upon to provide meaningful solutions. Isaiah's and Jeremiah's words and the statistics we've looked at might make us despair. We might wonder whether there can be any real solution to the environmental problems that afflict the earth and have done so since the fall. Well, left to man and his own efforts, there would be no solution to those problems. Individual problems might be solved, but the mass of them would continue to fester. But man is not the one who's going to solve these problems. God has a plan and a purpose with earth, and God will solve the problem. God created this earth to be inhabited, and to be enjoyed by man. So however badly man mismanages the environment, God in the end will counteract his mistakes. I'd like you to come now, please, to Isaiah 35. Now, Isaiah 35 is an interesting chapter. It is actually a chapter that has primarily a spiritual message. Make no mistake about that. Its first and primary message is spiritual. It speaks of a future time when God will be honoured and when the blissful conditions that applied in Eden before the fall will be restored. And that will be realised when the Lord Jesus Christ returns to the earth to reign as King over the world from the throne of David in Jerusalem. So the primary application of the words of Isaiah 35 are to the faithful who will be blessed in the kingdom age. But they are couched in language which also speaks of the reversal of the curse imposed on man and the environment after the fall. Look at verses 1 and 2. The wilderness and the solitary place shall be glad for them, and the desert shall rejoice and blossom as the rose. It shall blossom abundantly and rejoice, even with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon shall be given unto it, the excellency of Carmel and Sharon. They shall see the glory of the Lord and the excellency of our God. Drought and famine, desertification, soil degradation, they'll all be a thing of the past, but only in the age when people see the glory of the Lord, which is a reference to the Messiah. No matter how sincere, how dedicated, how diligent, how hard-working Greenpeace and similar bodies may be, they can never deliver that outcome. In another of his prophecies, Isaiah takes up the language of the curse in Genesis 3, when he writes of the time to come when the thorns that afflict the earth will be overcome. For ye shall go out with joy and be led forth with peace. The mountains and the hills shall break forth before you into singing, and the trees of the field shall clap their hands. Instead of the thorn shall come up the fir tree. Instead of the briar shall come up the myrtle tree. And it shall be to the Lord for a name, for an everlasting sign that shall not be cut off. As we said, again, a prophecy with a primarily spiritual message, deliberately hearkening back to Genesis 3 with its language. But what a wonderful image that presents in both a natural and a moral sense. And in Isaiah 35, in verses 6 and 7, we have more very comforting imagery. Though thou trustest in the staff of... verse 6 and 7 of Isaiah 35. Then shall the lame man leap as an hart, and the tongue of the dumb sing. For in the wilderness shall waters break out in streams in the desert. The parched ground shall become a pool, and the thirsty land springs of water. In the habitation of dragons, where each lay, shall be grassed with reeds and rushes. An environmental flourishing and in balance. An environment that's both flourishing and in balance. That's something beyond the reach of man today. But it will be the reality when the Lord Jesus Christ returns to the earth. And the blessings of that time will not be confined to the revival and recovery of the natural environment. As verses 5 and 6 say, it will be accompanied by the elimination of suffering of many who today are afflicted. Verse 5 and 6, then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap as an hart, and the tongue of the dumb sing. Now, many of the difficulties that people suffer, many of the physical afflictions that people suffer, not all by any means, but some of them, are due to man's mismanagement of the environment. And of course, the awful end of that spectrum, there are things like Agent Orange and the dreadful effects that has had on people who've been affected by the misuse of that chemical. But it's also true of many of the chemicals that have been used in agriculture and other purposes and in industry down over the years. Asbestos is another example of things that have caused a lot of harm to people. Well, the awful handicaps that have been inflicted on people through the misuse of such things, and regardless of the causes of those problems, all of them will be addressed in the kingdom age. After all, what value would there be in a pristine environment if the race given stewardship of the environment could not enjoy it unhindered? So, Greenpeace has now spent 50 years trying to solve the world's problems. They've worked hard, diligently, honestly, in many respects admirably. And during that half century, the condition of the world's environment has continued to deteriorate, despite their best efforts. Not just of Greenpeace, of course, but of the many other committed organisations that are devoted to environmental restoration. We must not blame them for their failure, because the problems the world faces are insoluble when left to the efforts of man. It is not in man to direct his steps. Only God can deliver a real solution to the problems of the environment. And God will do so soon when the Lord Jesus Christ returns to the earth to establish God's kingdom on earth. And if we wish to enjoy that time when Eden is restored, we must become one of the redeemed who will welcome Jesus when he returns. Isaiah 35 and verse 10. And the ransomed of the Lord shall return, and come to Zion with songs and everlasting joy upon their heads. They shall obtain joy and gladness, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away.